and welcome to Wrestling and Everything Coast to Coast with your host, Buddy Sotelo Esquire, wrestling's premier photographer, Dr. Mike Leno, and the effervescent Evan Ginsberg. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We have a very, very special guest for tonight. Man, I'm proud to say, is a Facebook friend of mine, is the son of the legend, once living legend, Harley Race, Justin Race. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey guys,
tonight.
how you doing? Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Great. So,
Dr. Lano, Evan.
Nice to meet you.
Yes.
Nice to meet you guys too.
So Justin, it came to Cauliflower Alley. I don't know if you, because I knew BJ obviously, but I don't think I knew if you were from his prior marriage. Then I didn't know her. Yeah. Did ride with Harley, like around Kiel, back and forth to Kansas City Memorial Auditorium and stuff like that. And then he rode around with him when he came out to San Francisco. But Russ and Evan said that you rode with him. So were you around? That's all I'm going to ask. Were you riding around with him in like the 70s and his?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, major.
Yeah, I was my mom and I traveled with him. My mom's name is Ivana. And in fact, we'll be at Cauliflower Alley this year. We're doing the seminar that Ron Hutchinson set up. But the learning series, actually, he calls it. Greg Oliver is going to kind of be a moderator. Mom and I will be on stage just answering questions, talking about my dad, this sort of thing. But 1970s, that was when my dad wrestled so much. I mean, 300 plus days a year, plus a couple weeks traveling. So if you want to be with Dad, you try to travel with it. So we'd go off and we'd get a van every summer and we'd go off traveling with him for 3 months. And in the 70s, after the matches, my mom would go back in the back of the van and sleep. And that's when I got to talk to my dad the most. I was the salami cutter, the cheese cutter, and the bartender / beer opener.
Wow.
Two little quick questions. Well, obviously, Happy Humphreys was one of the very first touring attractions, setting the stage for Haystack Calhoun and Andre, but different than the women and the midgets. That's what we called them back in the day. Very talented. But Happy Humphreys was a single male individual and such a draw, darling of the magazines and stuff. But I mean, Harley had to babysit and do all that. But the other thing was maybe, since I have to leave early, sadly, maybe you guys can talk about his involvement, which only a select amount of us knew in the 70s in the Kansas City office, the Bob Geigel Harley office, which was tremendous. And all of Harley's interaction with the great one, Sam Munchnick. I mean, all the promoters loved Harley, and what an incredible career. Wherever you look at him, Japan work, which was out of this world. His history in Toronto and everything else about Harley Race was just
Australia, the South Pacific,
yes.
Malaysia.
Yeah, well, the stuff with Flair.
I've been there. I've been everywhere with him. I was in 10 countries before I was 10 years old.
Well.
But like I said, you want to be with Dad, you travel with him. And the promoters were real good back then. Sam Mushnick, you mentioned him. Bubba from Japan. They knew that they put him. Oh, I'm sorry. They knew they put him in an impossible situation as far as his schedule and his traveling and whatever. So they often flew my mom and I with him, just because they knew that he'd perform a lot better if he got to be with his family occasionally.
Sure.
So they were real good about that back then. I don't think they did that for any of the other champions, but none of them traveled like my dad did.
Evan made a movie called 350 Days where, he talks about wrestlers being on the road 350 days a year, essentially. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Your dad was no stranger to that. And Evan, do you want to talk a little bit about 350 Days and what that...
1 hour every match. 1 hour every match.
What do you say to the fans who defend promoters who did not give legends who work 300 plus days a year They didn't get health insurance and pensions and 401ks like anybody else who would have worked 300 plus days a year for a particular employer.
Well, I don't think back then even professional football players had insurance. It just wasn't a thing. I mean, very few. Probably I don't in the 70s. I don't know any other careers except for wrestling. I mean, I knew my friends. Their dads were insurance salesmen and stockbrokers, whatever. But I don't know what kind of health plans they had. But it just wasn't a thing. I mean, you paid for that yourself. But back then, of course, on the other side of the coin, I mean, yeah, they should have done something for these guys that were beating themselves to death. But on the other hand, your private insurance was not bad back then. It wasn't like it is today. It was affordable.
Yes.
I did one thing. The guy at the insurance. I remember it was kind of funny. My dad I just happen to remember he was a good friend of ours. His insurance agent. He said, "Harley, just please don't tell me you don't skydive."
Yes.
We got enough to insure for your health and your well-being. Just please don't tell me you skydive.
So, what was it like growing up in a household where your father was a champion? I mean, was that something that was like a big deal when your father did hold the title? Did things change differently in the attitude in your house? Or was it just a belt with a piece of metal on it? It didn't really matter. He was the same guy 24/7.
I mean, it mattered. It mattered more when we were traveling with him at home. Yeah, it was a belt that sat in his closet. In the bag, in his that Halberton wrestling bag he used to carry around. I mean, I don't mean to sound aloof or whatever, but I didn't know any different. So I suppose what would have been weird for me would be him at home for dinner at 6 o'clock in the evening. That would have been weird. You learned, if that's the only thing you ever know, that's normal to you. I was lucky enough also, people often ask me, well, what about your friends? Were they bothering you all the time about your dad and this and that? I was lucky enough to be in the same school district from second grade until I graduated from high school. So most of my friends, except for people that of course moved in to the school district throughout that time, I was lucky to have, the same group of friends for the most of the time. So he wasn't Harley the wrestler or Mr. Ray. I mean, all the wrestlers called him either the Boss, King, or Mr. Race. My friends called him Harley. None of the wrestlers would. But to them, he was the guy that got up with my mom when I'd have sleepovers and made chocolate chip pancakes in the morning. He was the guy that grilled steaks. When you have a bunch of people over, my friends over, guys, girls, just guy, whatever. He was the guy that grilled the steaks. And they'd kid around with him. I mean, one of them would always want to take a whack at his, in his mid-size. Let me see if I can hit your let me see if I can hit you in the stomach real hard. He'd let him do it. He was kind of like a toy or a big action figure to them a lot of the time. But for the most part, he was just Harley. When I was very little and we'd be at the country club in the swimming pool, he was like a jungle gym. All the kids crawling all over him, and he's lifting them up and throwing them around the pool. And so he was kind of like larger than life, but normal. If that makes any sense.
That was my impression of him when I met him in 2007, and I had a chance to talk to him. It was interesting. It was the Fan Fest in San Francisco, and there were a lot of wrestlers there, but your dad, unfortunately, he was by himself. Nobody seemed to care that he was there, and I was like, I can't believe that.
Let me interject here, Justin, because this was the greatest in 50, 60 years fiasco ripoff I'd ever seen, and that's saying something in wrestling. These were the guys, the husband and wife, that took all of the money, the cash boxes, and left on night 2 of 3 nights. So your dad, Nick Bockwinkel, all of these great, legends, but they had their hotel rooms canceled, so the husband and wife promoters, these first-time promoters, could save the money. The return flights were canceled, so there were a lot of people that helped. I don't know if you remember that, the Cow Palace fiasco 2007, and we all mentioned
something about it.
Roddy Piper, Steve Austin, Bill Goldberg, they all lent money to help sort of restore that, but it was just a mess. Ring of Honor, all these groups brought shows. This was at the San Francisco Cow Palace, where your dad had a great relationship. One of the last few years of Roy Shire's tenure as promoter there. He came in almost annually starting in '76. When he and Dory came in for Roy's annual, his biggest show of the year, the Battle Royal. And then last three of those, Harley never missed them. Most of these guys would come in. The Battle Royal was oddly put at the beginning of the match, the beginning of the show, so the guys could rush to SFO and then fly into Narita Airport to Japan. So they were doing Roy a favor. But whoever won the Battle Royal often would have a title match. And I think these are the only two times that first Ray Stevens in 1980 and then Pat Patterson in 1981 worked against Harley as baby faces, but for the title. And the one prior to that was like Chavo, who won that particular Battle Royal. But because my time is a little bit limited, I wanted to ask something detailed. Harley was the first guy who made total business history globally when he surpassed Lou Thesz's record for NWA title.
Mm-hmm.
Lou had only done it 6 times. Harley surpassed that. But I wanted to ask if you did go with him to Japan, your dad dropped to both. First, it was Briscoe dropping the NWA title, and then regaining it 7 days later in Japan in December '74. But I think your dad dropped it twice, first to Baba and then to Saruta Jumbo.
Mm-hmm.
Is that recollection? And that was like, and then Harley would regain it afterwards. But that was like basically helping All Japan out, and few people in the U.S.
Sure.
for those title swaps.
Well, there's a couple things. Incidentally, that was on June 3rd, 1983, when he beat Flair to become to earn his 7th world title in the Kiel Auditorium in St. Louis, Missouri. The next day, there was a photo. I met the gentleman that took the photo. I can't remember what his name is. Dad was, after all the ceremony and whatever in the ring in St. Louis, he was on his way into the dressing room, and I had worked my way down there, and I was standing there. And he hugged me, and I was, about that tall at that time, and him, and you could tell I was crying or whatever, and you kind of tell he was crying maybe a little bit too. And that picture was on the front page of the Tokyo newspaper the next day, and not the front of the sports page, the front of the front page. Tokyo Shinbun, Tokyo newspaper, had a circulation at that time of about 22 million. And it said, Harley Race, 7-time world champion, not human, but God.
Wow.
Because in
the
Japanese
number 7.
folklore, when Japanese folklore, when a samurai warrior went to 7 battles and won, he was proclaimed a god. So they kind of translated into that what my dad did when winning the 7th world title. So he was very well revered in Japan. He did go there 60 sometimes. I went there, I don't know how many times with him, probably 20 or 30. But they treated us, not just him, but us, with such respect and loyalty and graciousness. It was amazing. They were just wonderful people. And he did lose the title to Bubba. I believe that was in 70 something.
Yeah, they were both
like 78.
Yeah, the one to
78, 79, somewhere in there.
Yeah, and then Jumbo followed to help get him over.
Yeah, correct. But they weren't going to leave the belt in Japan.
No,
so
that was it. Was
he was bringing it back. But yeah, they did, and it helped promote All Japan, New Japan Pro Wrestling. Back then, it really put them on the map. To have Briscoe too. The Funks went there all many times, but not only in Japan. The Funks and Briscoe and those guys didn't, but Dad went to, and I went with him. My mom and I went with him to Malaysia, American Samoa, and then of course Australia, New Zealand. So that whole South Pacific region really became wrestling fans because of what he did in Japan. They started to develop large crowds, large enough to where High Chief Peter Mavia brought him to Samoa.
And don't forget his wars with Carlos Colon in Puerto Rico. This was before the Brodies.
Uh, one of the times I was in the Caribbean with Dad and Carlos, Pedro Morales was there. But Carlos' dad and I went scuba diving, and we were. My mom couldn't dive because she had a ear infection. Of course, she can't dive like that. But we were diving on a shipwreck, and I found my way into the ship. Of course, it was a tourist attraction for scuba divers. It wasn't like you're going to find a body or something in there. So I found my way inside this old sunken ship, and I saw these portholes. And I looked through one, and I saw Carlos swim by. And then I saw him swim by another one. Then I saw him swim by another one. They were, of course, all busted out. So I went up and I kind of waited, and I waited for him to swim by this one. I reached out and grabbed his leg, and bubbles went everywhere. He freaked out, about drowned himself with the regulator stuffed in his mouth. And we got up to the top, and he started going off my dad. What the hell are your goddamn son scared me to give me a heart attack? This and that. My dad said, "It's not my fault. You got scared by an 8-year-old."
Yeah.
That's cute. That's cute. So, it sounded like you had a really good relationship, not just with your dad, but with the other wrestlers that you traveled along with. They were okay with him having an 8-year-old or 10-year-old or whatever following around, and they didn't feel that you were getting in the way or anything like that.
I grew up with a dressing room full of 300 and 400-pound uncles. That's how I was treated. I mean, he was the boss, and when he needed to talk to the other guys or something, he'd send me over with Brody or with whomever, Rick or whatever, and when he'd go out to work, and if I'd stay in the dressing room, he'd put one of them in charge of me. I mean, not like I was going to wreak havoc, but I was 7, 8 years old. Kind of get, 9, 10 years old, you get into mischief if someone didn't watch you. So yeah, I mean, Andre the Giant to me was Uncle Andre. I always called him Uncle Andre. Bubba was Uncle Bubba. A lot of the guys were they were just like my uncles.
And what was Andre the Giant like? What was it like to interact with Andre the Giant?
Big. You can't explain how big that man was. I don't know if any of you actually ever met him, but he did you? Yeah, you can't explain how big that man is.
Oddly enough, my dad saw him dining.
Oh, really? That's cool.
Yeah.
Andre tried breaking the Guinness Book of World Records for consecutive cans of beer drunken or consumed.
It said it.
It was December 14th in 1974 at the Channel 13 studios in Hollywood, California. So anyway, he passed out like 5 to 7 cans shy of the record. There was even an official there, which didn't often happen. I wanted to ask about, really, again, before I go, and I apologize because Evan's got to do some talking, something very historic that nobody talks about. Now, Bruno came in when he had his off period, when he asked Vince Sr. to take the strap off him the first time. And he came in and had about 5, 6 matches for Sam at Kiel that he'd never done before. First with Dr. Big Bill Miller, and then unmasking him, and then with Dick Murdoch. But the culmination was an hour Broadway with your dad for the title. And I don't think they ever worked before or since, but it was a Kiel Auditorium. It was humongous. They could have moved it to the larger venue in St. Louis at that time. But do you recall any of that? Because that was an hour, and that just shows how versatile your dad was. He could work with any style, from a guy like Abby to a Vern Gagne type, a Billy Robinson, or Bruno, could combine power and mat work.
Or Brody, or Abdul, or Abdullah. It didn't matter who it was.
And you've not even talked about the Hennig days, with Pretty Boy Larry Hennig and Handsome Harley Race, the 60s AWA days that put your dad on the map initially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that particular man, I was too young. Couldn't really tell you. I remember meeting Bruno many times when I was a kid, but we were talking 4 or 5 years old, 6 years old.
3 was when that match was.
Yeah, 3 years old. Of course, I heard about it, and I spent so much time in the dressing room. You eventually hear about everything, past, present, and what might happen in the future. So, Dad respected Bruno. I know that. Well, they had mutual respect. All those guys back then, those old guys, they had mutual respect for each other because they actually beat the hell out of each other. And you beat the hell out of somebody for an hour, and then and then go have a couple of beers, go to the next town, do it again the next time. You develop a heck of a bond. Remember when my dad started getting older and he, wasn't seeing the guys on a regular basis. When they'd come in town or when he'd go someplace and he'd walk into uh, Kevin Von Erich or Flair or whatever, it was like I can understand their feeling because I knew what it was like. But to me, it reminded like two war buddies seeing each other for the first time in a while that had saved each other's lives or something. There was so much unspoken speech between them that it was just like they knew what each other was thinking. They knew each other. They didn't have to ask what's been going on. They didn't have that little small talk crap. They just started talking to each other about stories and pasts and matches. And it was like they'd never, it might have been the first time they saw each other in 20 years, but it was like they'd never been apart.
I got to throw in one thing too. Your dad with the training, and I hope you guys will get into that when I have to go. The training, I shot several of the things that he did. He was like touring around. They did it in several cities with Ricky Steamboat and Les Thatcher, three great, brilliant minds. But I've been CACs, so you're going to Cauliflower Alley. I won't be there, sadly, next month or whenever.
Oh, no.
But I've been their photographer since '87. But Harley came in. It was like the dream all-star team. It was not just Steamboat and your dad and Les Thatcher, but the Hart brothers came down, and there was Buddy Rose and Ed Wiskowski, Easy Ed Wiskowski.
Oh, wow.
And, you guys broke in. Harley, your dad broke him in KC and also St. Louis. That was where he started. And I'm sure Bulldog Bob Brown helped. But all of these great trainers, but all of those guys were putting your dad on a pedestal. Like he was the ultimate guy.
Yeah.
And you look at Morris.
Well, he started training wrestlers long before he quit wrestling. He started training wrestlers in the 70s while he was wrestling them. I mean, Flair learned everything he knew from wrestling my dad from the ground up.
Right.
Hogan, I mean, all those guys, they learned how to wrestle by wrestling my father. They didn't have any schools back then or whatever. My dad was basically, the Zbyszko brothers basically tortured him into wrestling. But they just had respect for each other because of what they did with each other. And when you had someone like my dad, who every time you wrestled him, whether he was the champion or not, or whether it was the 70s or the 80s or not, you got a clinic in every match of how to wrestle. There was a match that I saw here the other day. I can't remember what it was, but Steve Austin said that was basically that match was like a wrestling clinic. You just watch that match from start to finish a couple hundred times, and you might figure out how to wrestle.
Osprey MJF, maybe?
Who the heck was it? Him and no, it was him and Terry Funk.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I don't know what year or whatever.
Not the title in '76 in Toronto.
It was when Terry got disqualified because he was bleeding so bad he couldn't see, and he was like bleeding dangerously. Where they actually did, they called the doctor to the ring. Sometimes that was for show, but they actually called the doctor to the ring because they had to stop the bleeding because he was bleeding. He was going to bleed out.
Wow.
And the referee did stop the match. But before that, Steve Austin said that was like a wrestling clinic. That match was. So when you wrestled with Dad, you learned something every match.
Didn't he also broke Curtis Hughes, the guy he managed in WCW towards the end, like 90, 91. But I think your dad, Curtis Hughes, Mr. Hughes, the guy he managed.
Yeah.
Yeah, your dad had his fingerprints on everybody.
Well, and then there was people like Vader. Dad managed him because no one else had the guts to do it. And Vader was out there hurting people.
Yeah.
And Dad wouldn't have that. Dad's foremost, his obligation in the ring was to make sure the fans were safe. And the second was to make sure the other wrestler didn't get hurt. I mean, get hurt in wrestling sense. I mean, that's not saying hurt for insurance salesman, but hurt in a wrestling sense. And Vader was out there hurting guys, and so Dad started managing Vader, basically to stop him, often to protect the other guy, but he did it real well. And rather than letting Vader beat the hell out of the guy, he pulled the guy out of the ring, whoever it was, and Dad would work on him outside the ring a little bit in a suit and tie until Vader come down. Then Vader would come out to get him, and Dad turned around and he'd say, "Leon, you big son of a bitch, settle down."
Mm. Did your dad like being a manager?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, he was every match he ever wrestled, he taught somebody something. So it was interesting for him to not actually be in the match, but watch it and then suggest things as the match went along. Well, the suggestion from my dad was, "You better do it or you're in trouble." It was like back when he was in the ring, when he'd if a match would get a little out, he was the ring general. Whatever happened in that ring, he decided. And if the match started to get out of hand, or people weren't doing what he wanted to, or however it went, he'd put him in an arm bar or a headlock or whatever, and he'd get his face down sort of close to the ear. "Don't piss me off." And they got back in line in a hurry. So he did that. He did that a lot with Vader. He kept Vader from hurting other guys by inserting himself in the match at the right time, making it look like he wanted to beat on the other guy, but basically he was just getting away from Vader because Vader gets doggone hyped up that he'd hurt people.
Justin, I got to go, but I remember twice shooting ringside. I forget what the venue was, but your dad told Leon to stop potatoing that guy.
Yeah. He was Andre. He called Andre the big son of a bitch, and he called Leon fat son of a bitch.
Wow. So we lost Mike for this session, but I'm sure he really appreciated talking with you. But
yeah,
we can tag out to Evan here, and Evan can now work you over in the corner a little bit. So Evan,
okay, cool. Well, and the sun moved, so I have a problem at this time of the year. The sun shines through the window behind me.
No,
so
everything's great. Everything's been great. Evan, why don't you ask a few questions?
Sure. What are you proudest of all your father's accomplishments?
January 10th, 1983, when he won the 7th world title. I mean, that would be the match, my favorite match, the one I was the most proud when he won, that sort of thing. I mean, I'm proud of everything he did. I'm proud of the fact that I get Facebook's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Facebook comments and stuff for days. And I put up pictures every once in a while and of the family, like him and I fishing and things like that, things that fans don't generally get to see. They don't ever get to see personal, family photos. And
I found those to be very touching, by the way. It's one of the main reasons why I wanted to have you on the show, is how open you've been about your family.
Well, I believe that I believe the fans need to see or should have the opportunity to see who he really was, who my dad was. He taught me when I was a kid. People would come up and, he'd be in town. We'd go out for a family dinner, just talk about my school or my sport, just regular family stuff. And people would always come to the table and ask for autographs. And, my mom, every once in a while, she's like, "God, I wish they'd just wait until we finished eating, or just give us a break here for a little bit." And he would say, "Yvonne, that person paid for this meal. That person paid for the vacation you just went on. That person pays for the roof over our heads. If it wasn't those people coming to watch me wrestle, we'd be living in a tent. So you do what you can to be as nice as possible to the fans." And then he kind of extending on that, he told me when I got old enough, he said, "Son, if people recognize you or recognize me or your name or whatever, give them their 5 minutes. Let them talk. Let them tell their stories. Let them ask their questions. Be as open and as forthright as you can with them, unless and just stop and give them 5 minutes, unless you're on the way to an emergency room or something. give them 5 minutes with you to talk, whatever they want to do. He said, because it's 5 minutes they'll never forget in their life. And that, at the time, he said, and you should feel honored that that happens. And at first I kind of was, I was like, okay. But as I've gotten through the years and gotten older, I find more and more honor in it each time. It's kind of like that they're honored to meet me. I'm more honored that they know who my dad is and want to talk about my father, because again, he was dad to me. They It's an inspiration, it's honor, it's just a great feeling I've seen senators and high government officials and CEOs of big companies and whatever, just for a moment in front of me, kind of melt and turn into a little boy again, telling me how they used to watch my dad on TV with their father on Saturday mornings or what have you, or Sunday mornings. And just for a moment, this guy in this $10,000 suit turns into a little boy right in front of me. And if that isn't an honor, and if that doesn't kind of, give goosebumps on your arm, that the honor that is, then I don't know what would. So
I was at Madison Square Garden, and your dad wrestled Bob Backlund, title versus title. This was 1979 or 80, and it was such a big event. It meant so much back then. And as fans, we were just thrilled. Here's Harley Race coming into Madison Square Garden, title versus title, NWA versus WWF. And he was great. I mean, he also came into the Garden and wrestled Dusty Rhodes for the NWA title and wrestled Tony Garea for the NWA title. And it was always a big event when your dad came to Madison Square Garden, because we understood. It was,
well, to put it in perspective, of how much he cared and how much he taught me to care, and back to what started this, why I like to release, post family photos and tell stories about dad being a dad. He was also just a dad. He had the discipline. He and I had our fun times. He and I had our crazy fun times. Incidentally, I'm writing a book about those times. It's called Don't Tell Your Mother. And that's exactly how every time we did something like Don't Tell Your Mother. But just to put in perspective how much he cared, when I started wrestling when I was 7 years old, with one of my first tournaments, somebody came up and asked him for an autograph, and he signed it. And he spent the rest of the day cornered in the gym, in a corner of the gym, with 100 or so people around him at all times, everyone wanting autographs. And he missed the whole tournament. Didn't see me wrestle once. So after that, I remember all the tournaments that I wrestled in, from little kids through high school. A little boy or little girl or an adult come up and ask him for his autograph, and you could actually see the pain in his face, like the physical pain in his face, when you have to say, look, I'm sorry, I can't sign an autograph for you here. If I sign one, I'll have to sign one for everyone in this building, and I just came here to see my son wrestle. And so he'd have to turn them down. And those times that he had to turn people down for one, that was pretty much the only time I ever saw him turn someone down, unless he was sprinting for a plane or something. You could actually see the physical pain and the emotional pain it caused him, that he couldn't give the person their autograph. And he was honored to give it as much as they were honored to receive it. And that's how I feel about what I do now.
How do you feel about major wrestling stars of today publicly saying, do not approach me for an autograph. This is my private time. You're infringing on my private time. But they'll sell autographs for hundreds of dollars at conventions.
Yeah, that's they don't know how to be champions. They don't know how to be idols. They don't know how to be heroes, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, did we have our private time? Yes, we had a lake house, a place in South Central Missouri called Lake of the Ozarks. And when we went down there, we had a home there for 15 years or whatever. I mean, until I went to college. And the restaurant owners and dock workers that, the gas docks and whatever for boats and all, after the initial meeting of him the first time, they realized that it was that this is his time to relax with his family. That was our peace time, or whatever you want to call it. There was one phone in the house, and I don't think anybody even knew the number. And the people left him alone there. They knew that was a one place where he didn't get bothered, because people just knew it's Harley. Yes, that's how. And you could see people, like we'd be eating in a restaurant, and you could see the owner go up to a table, and you knew what they were talking about. This group, family, whatever, was there on vacation, and they're asking the owner if is that Harley Race? Is that Harley Race? And the owners would always say yes, but I would appreciate it if you would respect his privacy on his vacation and just leave him alone. And they'd understand. But these guys nowadays, it infuriates me, and it makes me sad. It infuriates me because, well, they're hurting their own business, really. They're hurting their reputation. They're hurting the business. But it makes me sad because, how much, I mean, I get so many texts from people and Facebook thing, whatever. It said, I met your dad once, but I was too scared to go up and get an autograph. I feel so bad for those people, because Dad would have happily done it. Some of them were too scared because they thought he was really going to be mean to them, which he never was.
Your dad was very approachable. When I went to talk to them,
they were so intimidated. They didn't, and I feel very bad for them. I like, you can. I wish you would have. I usually write back, I wish you would have. I'd be happy to sign a picture for you
myself. I want to tell you to your face, your father was a very nice, very approachable fellow. Took a lot of time. I interviewed him for my professional wrestling organization that I was with, and posted it on the web. I did a thing back then called the Sotelo Spotlight, and your dad was more than generous with his time talking.
Yeah.
And
like I said, that's what he taught me.
Yeah, I was surprised.
5 minutes.
Look at his watch, or say, I've got other places to go. When he got into a story, he became incredibly engaging, and it seemed like he could really tell a story. While he was telling the story, you really could live out what was going on in the ring at the time. He was very good at expressing what was in his mind in the ring at that time, even though what he was talking about was like a match that happened 30, 40 years ago. His recollection of what went on in the ring was almost encyclopedic. Like he just remembered every moment.
It was even, toward later years in life, when he'd forget a lot of things, and didn't know what he had for breakfast or whatever, but he could recount almost move for move a match that he and Flair had in 1982.
It's amazing.
And that's a good way to put it. It was like an encyclopedic knowledge of not only his career, but of the business.
Absolutely.
But that's all he did. I mean, he never had a job. No, well, he worked on the farm as he worked on the Zabisco's farm. Stanislav and I can't remember the other guy, 2 brothers. They owned a farm, and Dad worked on their farm, and as payment, they taught him how to wrestle. Of course, back then, all that meant was they'd beat the hell out of him and put him in real submission holds and really hurt him, and just to see if he'd come back the next day and do it again. So that's how he started.
Wow.
And then now you have these guys today that, as Dad says, takes them 20 minutes to get to the ring for a 5-minute match.
We would be remiss if we didn't ask you about your life and your career. Tell us a little about yourself as well.
Well, I mean, I started wrestling when I was 7, and I won many state and national championships. I also played football. Football is my passion. My parents kept me away from wrestling and kept me away from the idea of becoming a professional wrestler, because, again, back when he was the traveling champion, it's just too hard on him, on his body, and too hard on the family. It was just, they didn't want me to grow up. They wanted me to grow up and know my children without having to drag them around the world. to be at their soccer games and their football games and whatever. And I will admit, my dad was at every one he could. He'd charter a flight from God only knows where just to get to my wrestling match in the middle of Nowheresville, Kansas.
Wow.
But so I went down that road. My dad said, you go to college. I'm sending you to college. You go learn something and become successful using your mind, not your body. Well, that's easy to say, but I grew up on a really nice golf course here in Kansas City, and he always used to tell me to play golf. He'd say, play golf. You can do it till you're 90 and make a lot of money doing it. And I did. I played a lot of golf, and I got pretty good at it. But when your dad's a professional wrestler, you want to be like dad. So I had to wrestle and play football and contact sports and such. So I went to college on a football scholarship, and when they did the physical, I didn't tell anybody this, but I had broke my neck in my sophomore year of high school in a wrestling match. It's just ironically enough. And they had to turn my head. I did. They said, that's all the farther you can turn your head? Well, I was just working on a sore shoulder. They stuck me in a CAT scan machine in 1989, which was quite a process back then. They found the calcium deposit in my neck, and they told me that I could no longer play football. My dream in life was to play professional football. So that went out the window, and I got several degrees in business, in the communications school, and advertising, sales, marketing, public relations, stuff like that. And I went to Japan, studied there for a year. That was something that I always wanted to do because I'd been there so many times when I was a kid. I knew a lot of the language. And I've been the senior sales manager and director of sales for many large companies. And now I own some businesses, and I also trade on the foreign currency exchange market.
Wow.
So I'm using as my dad said, use your noggin. So I'm trying to use my noggin.
There you go.
But you also say
athleticism ran deep in my family though. My dad was who he was. My mom was an aerobic instructor, and a professional water skier. Wow. So I still do compete in my age group. I compete in slalom, in water ski slalom course.
Wow.
So I still competitively do a sport.
Do you ever in your mind wish that you had done wrestling, had gone into more wrestling, or did that injury? If you hadn't had that injury, do you think you would have tried?
Well, if I hadn't had the injury, then I'd hope I would be retired from my professional football career. I don't know. I mean, you look back, and especially the money the guys make nowadays, like, well, I'm doing quite well myself, but you have quite a retirement set up if I'd have followed my dad's steps going that way. But then again, being who he was, and the GOAT that he was, and the legend that he is, those would have been pretty big shoes to fill in the wrestling ring. That would have been pretty tough. Being as tough as I'm tough. I was tough. I was a great wrestler, but he kind of had a different level. He was at a different level or a different bar than anybody had ever set. So I don't know how that would ever work out. The night I graduated from college, or not the night, but it's like graduation week. But your parents are there the whole time, and we were standing on the balcony of a hotel in Dallas, Texas, looking out over the city, and he said, all my life, his life, he's saying, I had this little thing in the back of my mind that says I should have broke you into the business, that I wish I would have broke you into the business. He said, but now that I see you standing here, graduating from college and moving on into a career of your life, I feel I made the right decision. Your mom and I made the right decision in keeping you out of pro wrestling. It's just too damn hard on you. And I think he was at peace then, and that put me at peace too. As far as if you should have or could have or would have or whatever. We kind of came to a truce that night, putting both our minds at ease.
Why? Do you think he always sort of in the back of his mind wanted you to become a professional wrestler? And
Well, that's what I'm saying. He always had this little thing in the back of his mind that wondered if he should or if he could break me into the business and whatever. But that night when I graduated, that week when I graduated from college, he put himself at ease that he and my mom had made the right decision, and I went the right direction, staying away from the
but it
business.
always told you on the side, I don't want you to be a wrestler anyway. He had always been saying,
Yeah. And they were serious. Both he and my mom were serious about keeping them. And me becoming a professional wrestler was never really an option.
Let me, if you don't mind, I'm going to throw a few names at you and just give you. You can just tell me over the top of your mind what you think of them and what your thoughts are. Let's just start with the first one, Ric Flair.
He and my dad were great friends. Rick always respected my father, taught him so much, taught him everything he knew pretty much in the business. But they were also very good friends. They had their moments in anger, but he was a great and is a great guy. Very humble. When you don't have a camera on him, he's very humble and very nice. He would tell you kind of how my dad and he went. That dent in the old NWA belt back in the 80s. There was a dent in the globe, and that was from Rick hitting my dad over the head with it. Dented the stainless steel. After that match, I was back in the dressing room. Dad's sitting there, kind of holding his head. He turned around, and Rick was sitting, across the dressing room, or whatever. He said, "Ricky, you hit me in the head with that goddamn belt one more time, I'm gonna stick it up your ass." And that ended that. He never hit him with the belt again.
Hit him with other stuff.
But they just had we visited his home when he was when we were in his neck of the woods in the Carolinas. He'd visit our home when he was in Kansas City. So we were really close. All of us were.
Let me throw out the name Dusty. Let me throw out the name Dusty Rhodes.
Dad called him the American Nightmare. He's another one of those guys that's surprisingly humble, alone by yourselves. Now, he and Dad would kid each other a lot. They do a lot of ribbing, but he was another one of those just good old guys. When you're a little kid, it really doesn't matter what you call people, and you get a little bit older, and it's Mr. or Mrs. And my parents always taught me you call them Mr. or Mrs. or Sir or Ma'am, whatever, unless they say, please use my first name or whatever. So it was Mr. Rhodes. Finally, with that list, just call me Dusty. Okay. So I call him Dusty.
How about Vince McMahon?
I have nothing bad to say about him. He's always been very, very nice to me. A story that when they crowned my dad, the coronation of the King of Wrestling in Poughkeepsie, New York, I was in the dressing room, and I found just whatever line there. I found I'll never forget. I found $240, $20 bills. And I went to my dad. I said, "Dad, hey, I just found this money." And he took it from me, and he went to Vince. He said, "Vince, my son just found this money." And Vince looked at him and looked at me. He said, "Boy, what a honest young man you have there. Could have just put it in his pocket." And my dad said, "Well, my son, I teach him the right way to do things." And Vince said, "Well, just let him keep it. He was honest enough to tell you he found it. Let him keep it." Hey, what the hell? He didn't need $240. It's a kid. And Vince said, "Harley watch." So Vince turns around to the dressing room, all the guys, and he says, "Anybody missing $240?" Of course, everybody raises their hand.
Yeah.
Bobby
Is it
Heenan
green?
said, "Is it green?" Yeah.
Has some presidents on
So, Vince turned back to Dad and said, "See, Harley, you're never going to find out whose it is." And, "Well, he's not keeping it." And Vince said, "Fine, Harley, I lost it. It's mine." So he took it from my dad, and then he handed it to me. He said, "And I'm giving it to you." And then when Dad was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, after the ceremony was over, that was incidentally supposed to be from like 7 to 10 or something like that. It was 2 or 3 in the morning by the time it got over with. You let all those old guys up there with no time limit on a microphone in a black tie situation, they're going to talk forever. So it was like 2 in the morning or whatever. We're riding the elevator back up to the hotel room. Sure enough, Vince and his wife get on the elevator with Dad and I. And I said, I thought about it for a second. I turned, I said, Mr. McMahon, do you remember many years ago in Poughkeepsie, New York, when I found that money and you gave it? He said, absolutely, I remember that. I said, still hope you're the honest young man that I knew back then.
Nice.
And didn't have to think about it without missing a beat. So I mean, yeah, I know he did. A lot of people don't like him. He's just a shrewd businessman, but he's always been nice to me, and that's all I have to base it on.
Let me ask 2 more. One is Terry Funk.
Wow. Terry, they had such brutal match. I mean, they were such good technical wrestlers, but they just had some of the most brutal matches I've ever seen. And my mom and Terry's wife, I think it was Vicky, were very good friends. So they were kind of like, well, mom and dad give me the babysitter and they go out to dinner, and it's my mom and dad and Terry and Vicky. So he was just a close friend of the family. He'd be like, where you can imagine growing up with your parents and like your next door neighbor or whatever, the father of your friend next door or whatnot. He was just kind of like another uncle, just very nice, very kind. Couldn't believe my dad. I mean, I couldn't believe my dad and him beat the heck out of each other like they did and still remain friends. But he's a wonderful man, until, the last time I saw him was not that long ago. I mean, some years before his death, but he had that soft, high pitched voice. And I was married at the time, and he shocked my wife because we had been actually before we got married, we'd been dating for 6 months before she found out who my dad was. I didn't advertise it, and she never asked. But then when she found out, she used to watch wrestling with her dad when she was a little girl, and Terry blew her away with that high pitched voice that he had. It was so kind and friendly. His voice
Out of
was
character from what he did in the ring.
Yeah, and she'd seen the bloodbaths that he and my dad have been. Well, she's like, his voice doesn't match who he is at all. She could never get it because my dad's voice, had a deep old voice he had. That matched who he was, but Terry's, he was one of those people that he seemed way too nice to do what he did.
Do you think your father would have been happy with the portrayal of him in the Iron Claw movie? No, he wasn't.
With the portrayal?
Yes.
The Kevin Anton, the guy that portrayed him?
Yeah.
I think he would have. I thought he did. I thought his name is Kevin Anton. I speak with him quite often. We become friends. He did a great job of portraying my father, especially the promo scene. He did that well. Were there things that I would have changed? Sure. Heck, there's been a lot of people that said I should have played my dad because I look like him.
Wow.
But Kevin, I think Kevin did a great job. If there was ever to be a movie about my father or something, which there is talks about a movie about him, of course, books. My mom's writing more of a memoir about what it's like being married to him, and I'm writing just a fun book. Don't tell your mother. It's stories about my dad, and back in the 70s, they had those Jeep Wagoneers in the glove box. You could turn the switch to red, emergency. All 4 tires pulled at the same time. Well, Rick loved my dad's, so Dad sold him his, and Dad bought a new one. We left the arena in Summersville, Carolina, and Rick pulls up and stops at a stoplight. Dad pulls up behind him, touches bumpers with him. He looks at me, I wonder how powerful this thing is. And he pushes him through the stoplight. Tires are screeching and blue smoke's flying everywhere. Well, a cop saw it. He comes roaring up behind him. He thinks he's going to make the arrest of the century. Rick gets out of the car. Dad gets out of the car. They both start walking toward the cop. The cop's jaw drops to the floor, and he starts calling for backup. not backup to help him make an arrest, backup calling all the other officers to come get autographs.
Yeah. That's
So
great.
all these cops show up and they give autographs, this, that, and whatever. And after they get finished, Dad gets back in the car. He looks over. Don't tell your mother.
Yeah.
And I never did. In fact, still today, I'll do podcasts and I'll tell a story. And when I talk to her the next time, she's like, "You and he did what?"
Yeah.
And I'm 53 years old. She's still learning about these stories.
Your dad knew not to tell your mother even back then. So
Can I ask one final question?
please.
Yeah, just to finish up though. So I do think that Kevin did a great job in the movie, in the Iron Claw. I think he did a great job.
Great. Go ahead.
I thought that too.
I'm always kind of shocked. I've been attending wrestling for 50 years. The first match I ever went to was 1974. And when I hear young people do their Mount Rushmore greatest of all time, inevitably they're going The Rock and Steve Austin, whereas I'm thinking Harley Race and Terry Funk and Ric Flair. Where do you rate your father? Where do you rate your father among the all-time greats? Number one. Yeah. Couldn't argue. Yeah.
And as far as
no one
interviews
took
go,
no one took more bumps than my father. No one passed along. I mean, during that documentary on The Dark Side of the Ring, Mick Foley said that he said, how do you call it? They're doing it Harley style. They don't even realize it nowadays, but they're doing it the way Dad did it. And they, maybe 20 years ago, they knew where it came from. Nowadays, one of the old guys will tell them, that's just how Harley used to do that move. And of course, they know. I meet the younger wrestlers now, and they still call him the boss. 20-year-old, 25-year-old wrestlers just broke into the business, just maybe made it in the WWE, and they, through their years and through the time in the dressing room, they realized that it's Mr. Ross, Mr. Race, the boss, or King. That's how you address him.
And I just feel wonderful after having met him in 2007 and shook his hand to get a chance to say thank you to your face of, being able to talk to you about your father and
oh yeah, absolutely.
And
the pleasure is all mine and the honor is all mine that you would even ask me to talk.
Well, when you have your book ready,
thousands of Harley stories, and I'd love to tell them all because if nothing else, it would give people a laugh for the day.
When your book is ready for publishing, we would love to help promote it from our show. We'll
I really appreciate that.
Yeah,
I really appreciate that, Russell.
We'd love to have you on again. You've been a great guest. We really appreciate your
Call me anytime.
And we'll have you on again real soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
everybody.
Dad used to always say, Herb told me this, Herb Simmons told me that. He said, I call your dad, and the first thing your dad would say is, where do you need me? And that's how I've kind of adopted that same attitude. If you need me for something, give me a call.
Thank you, Justin. You've been a wonderful guest. Have a good evening.
Thank you, guys. You have a nice evening. Thank you, everyone out there. Thank you, everyone.